I want to give a quick shout out to my patrons. Thank you so much for your support. Hey y'all, it's Kate from the Literary Apothecary, and welcome back to my channel. Now, today we're going to be doing something a little bit different, and I'm going to be talking about my favorite fantasy reads from 2022. Now, keep in mind this does not account for anything I'm currently reading that I may finish by the end of this week, but this is a pretty good estimation of the fantasy I've read in 2022. I kind of took this idea, an idea that Tiffany at Beautiful Minute said, to ranking all of the fantasy books that I've read this year, and I took my idea of my favorites that I got while I was doing the favorites in each genre last week, and kind of combined them into one video, because in the start of 2023, of course, I'll have my tournament of books where I go through all of the books I read this year, basically, with a few caveats. So I thought I would just narrow it down to my favorite fantasies for this video. So in 2022, some of my favorite fantasies include Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This book was so different. It was so fun. I loved the mixing of the fantasy with the historical elements. The fantasy definitely played a larger role than the history in this book, as opposed to some other books I've talked about in other videos, like the embroidered book, where the history was more prevalent than the fantasy. But this book, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, yes, it's a huge book. It's ginormous, but it was so interesting to me. I want to reread this one day. So if you all want to reread this with me, let me know in the comments below. I loved everything about this book. I could not think of a single thing I wanted to change in this book. Next up is Waking Ursa Minor by Helen Wright Patterson, and this was a self-pub book. I had the author on my channel to talk about this book and her next book because I loved this book so much. This kind of came at us in an unexpected way. I was on the Nerdy Narratives Discord and we were chatting, and someone said, hey, this author is looking for readers for her book. Anyone want to jump in on this? And we all went and read the premise of the book, and like a whole bunch of us jumped right in on this buddy read. We all loved it. It was absolutely fantastic. Great high fantasy with your, different magical, mystical creatures, and great storyline, great characters. I can't wait for the next book in this series. But before we get the next book in this series, we'll have a new book by the same author in a different world, a different type of book in January, which I'll be reading. That's called The Briar Crown. That's like a fantasy romance. But in 2022, Waking Ursa Minor was definitely a highlight of my reading year. A Natural History of Dragons by Marie Brennan. This is one of those books where I read it and I thought, why haven't I read this sooner? And why haven't I even heard of this book sooner? This book gave me like fantasy Jane Austen Regency era feels. It had the feel of a Jane Austen novel with the strong main character heroine who's very smart and sure of herself, but you have fantasy in there because she studies dragons. I absolutely love this book so much, and I can't wait to read the rest of the series. Maybe 2023, maybe a little bit further along. The next up we have is actually book number 3 in a series, and that is The High King's Tomb by Christian Britton, which is book 3 in the Green Rider series. I read book 1 and I liked it, but there were some parts I didn't love. I think I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I read book 2 and I did not like it at all. I gave it 2 stars, maybe 3 stars. But book 3, The High King's Tomb, completely saved the series for me. I haven't read further in it yet because my TBR hasn't allowed that yet, but I can't wait to read further in and see if it really did save it for me or if it was just a short reprieve in the series. But The High King's Tomb, I loved everything about that book, and it was just so good. 2 more books left on my list, and y'all know these 2 books I've talked about so much on this channel. First and foremost, of course, Jade Legacy by Fonda Lee. Also a third book in the series, but also the final book in the Green Bones saga. This book was everything. It was incredibly well written. It closed all of the holes, even the holes at the very end in like the last 2 chapters. You're like, oh, she left this open, she left this open. Nope, she came back and closed everything off by the end of the book. So you had no doubt that this was the last book in the trilogy, in the saga. It had all of the emotions you could ever imagine in a book. It made me laugh. It made me cry. Many times it made me cry. It made me hold my breath. It made me keep turning pages after page. I did not want to stop reading this book, and this is a huge book. This book was so well done. I had a book hangover after I finished Jade Legacy, like many people. I sat there and I just kept thinking about this book for weeks after I finished it. And then the last book on my favorite fantasy of 2022 is Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now this is another book that is kind of borderline on the historical fantasy realm. Not necessarily historical fiction in the sense that it uses real history, but it read more like historical fiction does. It read more like historical fiction than fantasy, but it definitely had the fantasy in there. It is kind of, again, Jane Austen, Regency era meets military fantasy. Is so well done. The prose in this book was some of my favorite prose that I read this entire year. It was so good. I already wanted to reread it, although I had to hold myself back. It was just so fantastic. I can't stop talking about this book. So those are my top 6 fantasy reads from 2022. Completely random number. I just went through my list of my favorite fantasies and marked off some that I wanted to really highlight on this channel. Some that you might not have heard of before. Some you've heard a little bit about but not a lot. And some you've probably heard about a lot but still deserve the attention. Like I said, I will have my tournament of books for all the reads I've done in 2022 coming out starting in January. All of the reviews that I've done for these books, I will link in the description below. Definitely go check those out if you haven't already. If you've read these books, any of these books before, let me know in the comments below. What were your favorites? What did you think? Did you love them as much as I did? As always, my Patreon and my Discord information will be in the description below. Keep reading, and I love y'all to the moon and back. Bye.